Okay, let's dive in. When you think about prisons, um, you usually picture places for detention, maybe rehabilitation, right?
Right, that's the idea anyway.
But the reality, in some places, well, it's much darker. We're talking about places that are basically hell on earth. Not just tough, but truly nightmarish.
It's quite something how these institutions, designed for order, can become the exact opposite. Extreme suffering, total breakdown. It really makes you question the whole system.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're exploring today. We're trying to get past the surface level, understand what really makes a prison dangerous.
Yeah.
We've pulled together a lot of research for this, firsthand accounts, investigative reports. The goal is to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding this critical issue.
And dangerous, it's important to say it's not just about inmates fighting each other, though that's often part of it. And
Hmm.
it's also about, the collapse of order, the loss of basic human dignity, the failure of the entire purpose of prison itself.
So for this deep dive, we're zeroing in on what the sources suggest are the 5 most dangerous prisons globally as of, well, May 1st, 2025. These are places, frankly, you wouldn't wish on anyone.
Which ones are we covering?
We've got Ciudad Barrios in El Salvador, La Sabaneta in Venezuela, Black Dolphin in Russia, ADX Florence in the U.S., and Goldani Prison in Georgia.
Okay, a pretty grim list.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy listening, but, it feels important to understand these realities.
Definitely. Looking at these five, different as they are, helps you see the common threads, but also the unique factors in each case. It's about the systems, the corruption, the complete breakdown of authority sometimes.
Let's start with Ciudad Barrios. It's in San Miguel, El Salvador. And the first thing that jumps out from the sources, it's primarily packed with members of the Mara Salvatrucha gang, MS-13.
And the overcrowding there is just staggering. Designed for maybe 800 inmates.
Yeah, around that.
But the reality, reports say over 2,500 people crammed in there. That kind of density, it's not just uncomfortable, it basically hands control over to whoever is strongest inside.
Exactly. And that leads straight into the danger. MS-13 pretty much runs the show. It's their territory inside the walls. Violence is constant, murders, assaults. It's horrifyingly common.
It's like a shadow government, isn't it?
Yeah.
The state's authority just evaporates. And the sources suggest the guards, they have very little real power.
Or worse, might even be complicit sometimes. That's what some reports indicate.
Which points to that bigger issue of how these gangs can just permeate state institutions.
And that ties right into corruption. Widespread corruption among staff, according to the research, allows weapons, drugs, you name it, to flow right in.
Which just fuels more violence, right? Turf wars, extortion. It makes a bad situation infinitely worse.
And forget about rehabilitation. Our sources say there's basically nothing. No meaningful programs. You survive by relying on the gang hierarchy. It just breeds more crime.
It becomes a recruitment ground, essentially.
Yeah. There was apparently a government crackdown attempt back in 2019.
I remember reading about that.
But it seems MS-13 just regained control pretty quickly. There's still reports of inmates being killed just for, not following gang orders.
Yeah.
And the authorities seemingly unable to stop it.
It shows that just sending in more force doesn't fix the root causes, does it? Not if the overcrowding and the corruption aren't dealt with systemically. The power dynamic just snaps back.
So putting it all together, you can see why Ciudad Barrios ranks #1 in our source analysis. It's lawless. Gang rule trumps official order. Add the insane overcrowding, the corruption, the nonstop violence. Survival is literally a gamble every single day.
It's a terrifying picture of the state essentially abandoning control within its own prison. Just devastating for those inside.
Okay, let's move continents. Venezuela, La Sabaneta prison in Maracaibo. This one, our sources say, is kind of a symbol of the prison crisis across Latin America.
And again, that theme of overcrowding hits you immediately. Built for what, 700?
Around that, yeah.
But holding over 3,700, it's hard to even picture that density.
It is. And like in El Salvador, that overcrowding is a catalyst for danger. Gangs control different sections, enforce their own rules with extreme violence, extortion.
There was that horrific riot in '94, wasn't there? Over 100 deaths.
Yeah, mentioned in the sources. And sadly, that kind of violence, clashes between groups, it's still a regular thing.
But what seems particularly awful about La Sabaneta, based on the reports, is the sheer neglect that goes with the overcrowding. Inmates sleeping in shifts, or on floors soaked with sewage.
It's unimaginable. And basic needs food, medical care severely lacking. Malnutrition is rampant. Diseases like TB spread easily. It's described as a humanitarian disaster.
Just basic survival needs aren't being met.
And layered on top of that, corrupt guards again. Underpaid, understaffed. Sources say they often work with the gangs, selling weapons, looking the other way.
Which just pours gasoline on the fire, doesn't it? Makes the whole situation ungovernable.
The state of the health wing is mentioned specifically. Past reports noted incredibly high HIV rates. Medical neglect is still a huge problem, costing lives.
It shows a complete failure by the state to provide even the most basic duty of care.
Our sources also flagged a massacre in 2013. 16 inmates killed in a gang clash. And what's shocking there is how easily prisoners seem to get firearms.
Firearms inside a prison.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes about the breakdown of security, doesn't it? It means the institution itself is actively enabling the violence.
So, what's up, Anetta? Number 2, why? It's that toxic mix. The extreme overcrowding, the powerful gangs, the total institutional collapse, the appalling conditions. It's a human rights catastrophe where inmates are in constant danger.
It really highlights how a system pushed beyond its limits and riddled with corruption just completely fails, utterly fails.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Russia, Black Dolphin Prison near Kazakhstan. The danger here feels different. This place holds Russia's most notorious criminals, serial killers, terrorists, even cannibals.
Yeah, unlike the first two, the main danger isn't necessarily gang warfare fueled by overcrowding, though having those kinds of minutes together is obviously risky. Here, it's more about the regime itself, the extreme restrictions, the psychological pressure.
Exactly. The sources really stress the isolation. Tiny windowless cells. Inmates locked down for 23 hours a day.
Wow.
And when they are moved, blindfolded, handcuffed, bent over, it's designed to prevent any chance of planning an escape. But the psychological impact. It must be immense, severe distress.
It's the deliberate use of isolation as a control method, maybe even extra punishment, and the research suggests it works, in a grim way. Severe psychological damage, even psychosis. It raises huge ethical questions, even for people who've done terrible things.
And it's not just isolation. The discipline is incredibly harsh. Forced labor, constant surveillance. Reports mention physical and psychological abuse by guards treating inmates like robots, basically.
Yeah.
Stripping away hope.
That name, Black Dolphin, from a sculpture outside, seems so out of place with the reality inside, and the impossibility of escape. 247 cameras, armed guards that must just amplify the feeling of being trapped forever, the psychological weight.
The sources mentioned Vladimir Nikolaev, the cannibal, to give you a sense of who's inside. Just knowing you're locked up with people like that must add to the overall fear.
There was that documentary in 2011, right? Gave a glimpse inside, an inmate saying all hope is lost here. That's chilling.
It is. And while the secrecy around Black Dolphin makes verification hard, those persistent reports of excessive force by guards are deeply worrying.
So the danger here isn't the chaos of gang rule, it's the opposite in a way. It's the crushing weight of control, the psychological torment, combined with housing Russia's absolute worst offenders. It creates this uniquely oppressive, dehumanizing environment.
A very different kind of hell.
Yeah, one that targets the mind, the spirit, forces you to confront those really difficult questions about punishment.
Let's head to the U.S. now. ADX, Florence, Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It's the highest security federal prison, holding really high-profile, dangerous criminals.
And the core principle there, like Black Dolphin in some ways, is minimizing human contact. It's a supermax built around isolation, and that isolation is the key danger.
Absolutely. That prolonged solitary confinement, again, 23 hours a day, small concrete cells, very little human interaction. The sources are clear about the mental health toll, severe depression, psychosis. Tragically, at least 8 suicides there since '94. It's a stark statistic.
And the rationale, is control, preventing these high-risk inmates from organizing, escaping, influencing things outside.
Yeah.
But the human cost, it's undeniably huge.
And look who's been there, or is there now.
Oh.
El Chapo, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston bomber. It's an incredibly volatile mix of individuals, all kept in this extreme isolation.
The thinking is they could still pose a threat, even from inside. Directing crime, inspiring others, ADX aims to shut that down completely.
But the sources also highlight allegations of abuse by guards. Physical, psychological mistreatment. There was that big class action lawsuit in 2012 about the treatment of mentally ill inmates. Reforms were ordered, but progress seems slow.
That raises questions about oversight, doesn't it? In such a lockdown, secret environment, how do you ensure accountability? The potential for abuse feels higher.
And rehabilitation. Similar to Black Dolphin, it's basically off the table at ADX. No real educational or recreational programs. The focus is purely security, which probably just makes the psychological decline worse.
It's almost like a failure to meet basic human needs, even for the most dangerous prisoners. What does that level of isolation do to a person long term? Ethically, it's troubling.
The suicide of Jack Powers in 2016 is mentioned as a specific tragic example, someone reportedly broken by solitary. And the secrecy makes it hard to know everything that goes on, which draws criticism from human rights groups.
So, ADX Florence, maybe less inmate on inmate chaos than, say, Ciudad Barrios, but the danger is profound psychological damage from that extreme isolation combined with housing incredibly high risk people. It's punitive in a very specific mental way, even if physical control is tighter.
Okay, our final stop, Galani Prison in Tbilisi, Georgia. This place became infamous for systemic brutality and serious human rights abuses.
Yeah, that 2012 scandal really put it on the map, didn't it? The leaked videos of guard-led torture. It exposed major problems in Georgia's prison system.
That scandal is key. The sources describe videos showing guards torturing, beating, even raping inmates. It caused massive public outrage, nationwide protests. Reforms were promised, but, well, reports of abuse seem to continue.
What's really unsettling about Guldani is that the main threat often comes from the guards themselves. Not necessarily inmate versus inmate, but the people in charge being the abusers. That's a fundamental inversion of how things should work.
Exactly. And alongside the guard brutality, you have the familiar issues: overcrowding, neglect, cramped, unsanitary cells, disease outbreaks, not enough medical care. The usual grim picture in that regard.
It seems like a lack of effective oversight and corruption are big parts of the problem there, too. The sources mention riots and protests inside Guldani over the years, often signs of deep systemic failures and inmate desperation.
And you have to think about the psychological impact. Living under the constant threat of violence from the very people who hold power over you, it creates an atmosphere of intense fear and trauma.
Even after the 2012 scandal, the minister resigning, all that, the implemented reforms maybe haven't gone deep enough. Human Rights Watch noted ongoing issues like overcrowding and poor health care as recently as 2023. Significant problems clearly remain.
So what makes Guldani stand out as dangerous, according to this analysis? It's that unique horror of guard-perpetrated violence being the defining feature. While other prisons struggle with inmate violence, here the authority figures are a primary source of terror. And despite reforms, the persistence of abuse and bad conditions keeps it on the list of the world's worst.
It really hammers home how crucial accountability and the rule of law are within prisons. When the guards become the abusers, the whole system just collapses ethically.
Right. So looking across all five,
Mm-hmm.
it's striking. You see common themes, but also really distinct forms of danger.
Definitely.
Ciudad Barrios and La Sabaneta top the list in the sources, mainly because of that sheer lawlessness, the gang dominance, amplified by the crushing overcrowding and corruption.
Yeah, in those places, the state seems to have just lost control inside the wire. It's internal anarchy, survival of the fittest, or survival within the gang structure.
Then you contrast that with Black Dolphin and ADX Florence. Control is absolute, almost suffocatingly so. But the danger there is the intense psychological damage from extreme isolation.
Mm-hmm. And those places force you to ask tough questions about the long-term effects of that isolation. Is that really justice? Does it help anyone in the end?
And Guldani. It stands apart because the primary threat is the guards themselves, the systemic brutality. Even with attempts at reform, it shows how hard it is to fix deeply ingrained problems like that.
Guldani is a chilling example of what happens when power inside a prison goes unchecked, without real accountability.
These five prisons, awful as they are, they really shine a light on wider systemic failures, don't they?
Yeah.
Overcrowding, corruption, basic neglect. You see these patterns globally, especially it seems in Latin America where resources are stretched thin.
Absolutely, and systems can become overwhelmed, leading to gangs filling the power vacuum.
But then, even in supposedly more advanced systems like the US or Russia, you see the ethical dilemmas raised by places like ADX and Black Dolphin. That focus on extreme security, potentially trampling on human rights and any chance of rehabilitation.
It's a different kind of failure, perhaps, but still a failure.
And Guldani just screams danger when the guards themselves hold unchecked power and abuse it.
The human cost in all these places is just staggering. The physical trauma, the psychological scars, very little hope for genuine change or reintegration for many inmates.
And it's rough on the staff, too, you have to imagine. Working in those conditions, often without proper support or safety.
And ultimately, these environments don't just hurt the people inside, they fuel recidivism. People come out more damaged, potentially more dangerous, which harms society as a whole. It's counterproductive.
So what's the way forward? Our sources point to reforms pushed by groups like the UN, Human Rights Watch, things like tackling overcrowding, Maybe new facilities, maybe smarter sentencing for nonviolent crime.
Yeah, and strengthening independent oversight. Real inspections, transparency, ways to fight corruption and abuse. Accountability is key.
Also, banning or seriously limiting solitary confinement, recognizing how damaging it is, like the UN Vandela rules suggest.
And, crucially, investing in actual rehabilitation, education, job training, giving people a chance to build a different future, breaking that cycle.
Some sources point to places like Norway as maybe offering a different model, focusing on humane treatment, rehabilitation, alongside security.
It shows it is possible, right? That humane prisons can exist and might actually lead to better outcomes, safer communities. It's not a contradiction.
So, wrapping this up, these 5 prisons, Ciudad Barrios, La Sabaneta, Black Dolphin, ADX Florence, Colodani, they really represent the darkest corners of global prison systems. They expose what happens with neglect, corruption, and just fundamentally flawed priorities.
And while the danger looks different in each one, gang rule, psychological torture, guard brutality, the common thread is that erosion of human dignity, people trapped in cycles of violence and despair.
Looking at this stuff, the need for real systemic reform feels overwhelming, doesn't it? Turning prisons from these places of suffering into actual places of rehabilitation. It's not just, a nice idea. It feels essential for a more just and ultimately safer world.
Which leads to that final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. How does the way we treat people who've broken the law reflect on us as a society? And do systems like the ones we've looked at today, these extreme examples, do they actually help us achieve the goal of safer communities? Or do they perhaps make things worse? Something to think about.